Freedom is not the freedom to do what you wish, but the freedom to do what you ought.
Good Wednesday morning, and today, John just introduced it, we're going to be talking about freedom. My name is Craig Flood. I'm the host for this podcast, and be sure to stick around till the end because I'm going to end it, but I'm also going to leave a little extra talking that John and I specifically did just around family, reading, and all the things that I need to start doing with my kids. So if you want to hear that, then be sure to stick around.
You get the Archbishop of York say, we're thinking about changing our Father because it's too sexist. When you get to the stage of taking our Lord's words and saying, we think he could have done better, you're in a pretty serious state of decline. And when it's the second highest position in the Anglican Church worldwide, it's even more frightening. And they're also putting in a special version of morning prayers for transgendered people. This is woke nonsense gone viral at a level that, well, it hasn't gone viral, fortunately, except in an anti-sense as it should. But as so often, sensitivity towards other people is good. But when it trumps everything else, no, it's not. There is an order to good things in the world. Some are more important than others. Yes, sensitivity is right. I mean, I love that line at the end of Pride and Prejudice where Darcy and Elizabeth have realized that they're in love with one another, that they're made for one another. And Darcy says to Elizabeth, you must have thought me devoid of all proper sentiment. What a lovely phrase. We wouldn't even think, for most of the Western world now, that amongst other things, we are hopefully training our children to proper sentiment. That's what I was trying to get at with reading Augustine, which would be demand more of you than most people read when they're reading double-spaced devotional literature. They don't have proper sentiment towards literature. So phrases don't stop them in the Bible because anything, that phrase is so recurrent, or that thought is so recurrent. And off you go on a journey through the literature, which I hope you know well. And the more you know it, the more you enjoy it. Whereas I most often these days hear a phrase from the Bible which clearly has not been understood by the person using it. When I quoted Frost in Harvard, I was aware it being largely a feminist STEM end of the sector, where Frost says, worship, humour and conscientiousness went long since to the dogs under the table, and served us right for having instituted downward comparisons. The dogs under the table, for me, immediately brought Christ into my mind. I hope for you too. The wonderful story of his interaction with the Syrian woman who wanted something of him, and he said, I have come to the Jews, and she said, the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. It's a lovely story, and that single phrase brings that whole lovely story into mind. And that's why good Christian writers are appreciated by other Christians, even when they don't trace what's going on, because there are always echoes of Scripture in the writings of people who are deeply Christian. And in fact, all great writers know they need the biblical metaphors, writers in the Western tradition. And you don't achieve anything by removing them. You make everything less, not more. But that's what we're trying to do at the moment with editing, writing, which we have no right to touch. And the people doing the touching, of course, are ignoramuses to boot. So the outcome is bound to be both useless and ugly. But that's where we've got to. So those things have been on my mind and wondering why we're falling away in so many different areas. And I had a little experience with ChatGPT. I wrote an article for the CMDA magazine. I write once a quarter, a short article, 1,500 words or so. And I thought, let's see what ChatGPT would do if I'd finished it. Then I just gave them my name and the title and waited to see what would happen. Well, it was remarkably smooth, as it always is. One of the ways you can tell when students are using it is that it's smooth and there are no grammatical errors of significance, but there's no unique usages either. But it was as though it had got a tin ear for transcendence. I hope that anything I do in the area of writing or speaking at least brings into people's minds the transcendent dimension of human life. We are here today, gone tomorrow, and after that the judgment was the understanding of the Western world for 2,000 years. And now we behave as the only thing we can do about this is to pretend it isn't so. But without transcendence, you have a problem. And thinking about that, the first place that this comes to mind for me, of course, is with the dying of patients. My brother-in-law has got terminal cancer, and he wanted to talk to me this week about end things. In particular, it was an interesting phrase. He said, I know you don't approve of euthanasia in any way, so I don't want to go that way. Well, he hadn't thought it through, but he said, it's very hard to go on, and I wonder if it's worth it. Now, we talked about that a bit. We don't die to ourselves. We shouldn't die for ourselves. The famous line, no man is an island entire unto himself. Send not to ask for whom the bell tolls, for it tolls for thee. Our death is part of everyone else's life as well as our own death. We are all caught in this mortal coil. And for the modern world, christenings or baptisms of children, marriage, and dying are the only times that some people will hear the gospel, that we're more than just another animal. So it's important that we learn how to use those times much better than we are. And of course, more and more people are not bothering with a funeral service. That's the post-Christian world.
Yeah.
So transcendence really matters. The piece I quote all the while, Lev, when he's talking about justice, what we want is to be simultaneously perfectly free and perfectly ruled. That is, at the same time, to discover the right and the good and to invent it. Without an understanding of transcendence, that sentence has no power, but with it, its power is increased n-fold. The bottom line is, in the post-Darwinian world, we are losing our way because it changes the way we make choices. I remember the first time I was really forced to think about this many years ago now. I used to help out the local boys' brigade, mainly by taking the boys climbing, rock climbing. But the deal was they couldn't go on the rock climbing trips if they weren't a regular attender at Sunday school, the boys' brigade Sunday school. So they came for that reason, and others like it. They like the activities, they like the marching, they like the instruments, they like the gym, etc. But one Sunday, I asked the boys who were from the East End of London, what's wrong with stealing? And quick as a flash, one of the kids said, getting caught, sir. And I thought, my goodness, that's it in a sentence. It wasn't wrong unless you got caught. Well, that's Darwinian. The Christian response would be, God told us not to. Now, we don't usually think about why, but if we took that back, we would say, oh, yes, because God gives the law and says, if you keep this law, then you will flourish. It's not a small thing. The Decalogue, and something like it, can be found in almost every culture. Lewis does that for you at the end in the appendix to The Abolition of Man. He says, just spend a few hours in the library with a dictionary of comparative religions and you can find this stuff, but he's done it for you. We all have something like it. They're not all the same. The orderings are different. The nuances are different. But all cultures have something like that until we came to the post-Christian Marxism, which, of course, is a Christian heresy. It thinks that man is perfectible, whereas anybody who belongs to any of the great traditions knows that that is not true. The fall, as Chesterton said, is the one surely undeniable Christian insight, Christian doctrine. So what happens when you change that to everything is a battle for the genes, nature red in tooth and claw, which it is in many ways, you can see it. But of course the animals have no abstract world like we have. Language is critical at this point, but we do live in a world that has dimensions that no animal has. They're not capable of thinking about their great-grandchildren, whereas we ought to be, as we live in inflationary ways, basically just handing all the debt to our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, at the size it's getting to now. We wouldn't have done that in the past, the sheer shame, but that's disappeared from politics. It's all about the next election cycle, nothing else. We've got to learn how we speak into that environment, and there are ways of doing it. So without transcendence, you have no oughts, no shoulds, no musts. And you cannot bring that up your family without saying, no, you must do that. And they say, why? And you say, because it's the right thing to do. What there is packed in that sentence, that out there's a whole set of rights and wrongs which you have not yet properly understood, but the decision you are about to make is on the wrong side of that equation. And if you don't get that right, you will be in trouble. First with me, but most importantly later with God. Now, initially, of course, children are effectively living in the present, and they even have trouble distinguishing between what they imagine and what they experience. But nevertheless, they are moral beings. They know certain moral truths that are written on our hearts. Our job is to build that into a much more effective guide for life. And that we are not doing. We're frightened to say anything against what our children think at the moment, because we haven't practiced being articulate and having an authority which they respect. I mean, if we come home and put our feet up in front of the moving wallpaper and haven't picked up a serious book in 20 years, how can we expect them to have any respect for us at that level? We have a duty to do it. Give attention to reading, says Paul. He knows why. And as he says to Timothy, you must train people so that they rightly divide the word of God in the King James Version, that they can listen to it and they can say, yes, I understand that. It's rather difficult. Now let me think, what do I do next? And their reflexes are to compare Scripture with Scripture. You can't do that if you don't know it in the first place. And that provides you with a nuanced understanding of what's going on, so that you don't just say, you'll do it because I say so. Because once you start thinking about it, you can point out what will happen. Those same young men, boys they weren't even young men, boys in the Boys Brigade, living in the East End of London, had different words. Stealing was a big deal, but nicking wasn't. Oh, I just nicked it. I mean, somebody had left some money. I just picked it up. No big deal. But it is a big deal because it is stealing, and you have become a thief. The first thing that happens when you break those rules is that if you don't tell the truth, you become a liar. You can't avoid that. And if you go on doing it, soon the lies will control you and not you the lies. And that happens to every one of these great ideas. And you've got to put those before your children in a way that makes sense. If you do that, and then you do it again, and then you do it again, shortly it will control you and not you it. That's why even gossip is bad. Paul puts it next to murder in the list in Corinthians. I think that's right. I think gossip probably, well, I'm sure it's worse than many murders. I mean, if my wife murdered me, and after all, your spouse is the most likely person to murder you, she'd probably have every justification in the moment. It's just convenient and for her and me that she hasn't had the meat cleaver in her hand at the right time, so to speak. Yeah, I'm sure I can be extremely annoying. So if she did kill me, it would be an emotional act when I really rubbed her up the wrong way, and I got what I deserved in a way. She'd have to go to prison because of the social consequences of murder have to be apparent, although we're getting to the point now where there's some people say, well, blacks can't commit certain crimes because of their victim status. That is so patronizing. If I was black, you're saying to me, I'm just a child morally? That's insulting. But they don't see it that way. They're just race hustling. It's very dangerous, most dangerous to them, but dangerous to us all. We need these things in place. When the banks were opened, Western-style banks were opened in Russia, the Russians didn't appreciate what underlies banking. And if you put your money in a Russian bank, they sort of took off with the money and the bank disappeared, and so did your money in many cases. Now the Jews ran the banking system in the Western world because God had taught them, you must keep your promises. I will punish you one day if you do not keep your promises. If they agree to pay 10% when they should only pay 5%, that's their fault. That's okay, you can do that. But if you say 5%, you are not to charge them 5.5%. And that, of course, is at the heart of banking. Without that trust, banking cannot happen. You think of what you do when you put your money into a machine with a card. I mean, what evidence have you got for the reality of that money? And why shouldn't someone, and of course they do quite frequently, manipulate that money to some other place? At its heart, like medicine, banking is a moral activity. And if you fail morally, you will fail in your profession. The law was the same. It was the pursuit of justice, but not anymore now. As my grandson in the law school told me, it's all procedural. What we learn is the procedures. And we can take back to find out what judgments were made before very easily, and that's going to be increasingly so with AI and its applications. In fact, many legal jobs are going to disappear with AI. I haven't seen for a long while why conveyancing in the sale of a house should be any more difficult than the sale of a car. All you need is a good registry system. Well, that can all be computerized. You ought to be able to sell your house as fast as you sell your car. And if the person wants to get an evaluation, you can do that with a car. You can do it with a house. It's a sitting duck for takeover by clever lawyers who want to run a very big system, and all they're putting is their name onto work that's done by AI. There are lots of things in that area. But human beings can't be handled entirely in that way. So, the one that got me, one of the other ones that got me going this week is over 5,000 people have had their accounts stopped at banks in England, and no reason has been given except that they have said somewhere things that are judged by people with the power to do it that make them unworthy of banking. That effectively is to remove them from society. They've overstepped here, and I hope that the pushback is going to be absolutely huge. And any bank that had the smarts would be getting up very quickly and going public and saying, we are never going to cancel anybody's account without telling them why, whether it was the government who forced us to do it or whatever. But we're not going to do it willingly. That's not the business we're in. We're in the business of serving you. And if you're not cheating us, we have no reason to cheat you. Any bank that does that, and then we should all change our bank accounts and move it there. I mean, we have demonstrated when they rile us up enough and we start reacting, we have huge power. Look how Bud Light has lost millions of dollars. We could do the same with Disney. We probably are already. And the pride people have got the tolerance they asked for 20 years ago, but they're not displaying it in return now. That's not consistent. If they receive tolerance, and they have received tolerance on a huge scale, they need to display that tolerance in return. They are only about 4% of the population. It's only where if the truth were that it's only power, they're nobody in terms of numerical power, voting power, if we voted in the appropriate way. But they're working very hard and very effectively to take the whole thing over. But we can push back. Everyone who is listening to this who hasn't read Lee Harris's article of some 15 or more years ago, Can Tradition Survive, should read it. Because, as I understand it, he was a homosexual who saw that they were going to win and it was going to be a disaster for everybody unless some really thoughtful people didn't take charge of the ship. At the moment, clearly, it's driven by emotion and by anger. That's not the way to go. So you can go down the list and start looking at behaviors that can be traced back to a failure to really incorporate into your life the basic tenets of the Ten Commandments. J. Badzinski's book, What We Can't Not Know, a lovely double negative which your English teacher told you never to use, but when you do use it, just very occasionally, as in this title of the book, it's brilliant, isn't it? What we can't not know, what we can't deny. Now, what he's arguing in that book is something very like the Ten Commandments, is universal knowledge. Very few people could even tell you the Ten Commandments these days, but nevertheless, we all appeal to them when we're on the wrong side of the equation, so to speak. And in that book, he does it absolutely brilliantly. It's one that every serious Christian should have on their shelf, in my view. Along with Peter Crave's Refutation of Moral Relativism, put those two together. And you'll have a lot of material for pushing back around you, just simply by asking questions, which is the next key in this process. I listen to people who become sort of emotionally aware that they're being manipulated, and they immediately start making statements that haven't been well thought out. Hold your tongue under those circumstances. What you need is a question. And if you don't know what it is, the prayer help is almost invariably answered on the spot. And if it isn't, it's because you're not ready to go into this argument. But now you have to go away and do the work. Why was I so upset by that? What are the questions I need to ask to come back on that? Why did the whole world think differently until a very short period ago? Well, of course, as long as you were living subsistently from hand to mouth, the idea that having children was a luxury that you should have when you got the chance was unthinkable. Before mechanization, you couldn't run a farm in North America that would feed your family with less than half a dozen hands at work every day. So you needed those children. it worked very well. But nobody would have suggested that you should have a way of life that didn't lead to children. That was all around you to be seen in the animal kingdom. If you stop doing it, you'd die out. And it would be very quick. It would happen very quickly in a society that was not mechanized in any way. So this is only a product of modern technology, which could fail at any moment, so to speak. And we are on the edge of trouble. And some countries, like particularly Germany, China, Japan, Quebec, not a country, but I think the lowest reproductive rate in Canada, nowhere near replacement. We are currently solving a problem by bringing in people from other parts of the world with entirely different cultures. And you discovered when you had good immigration, you initially took people at least who would have said they believed the Ten Commandments are true. And you took a break too, because you realized there were some problems with getting people to join the society rather than form enclaves within that society. Now, in places like, well, the city where I grew up, Birmingham, now has whole areas of Birmingham, very close to where Tolkien was born, where the police have no say. It's a Muslim ghetto, in effect. Now, they may take over, and it's our own fault if we don't have a culture that's strong enough to say, no, we think you should do it our way. You can't. Mrs. Thatcher was right when she said to King Saud, when he wanted her to come to the dedication of a mosque in London, she said, certainly if I can come to the dedication of a church in Riyadh. That's fair comment. Of course, she didn't go to the dedication of the mosque because they were not going to do that. There's no quid pro quo involved in cultural exchanges in most cases, except ours. I mean, we are now into self-flagellation and denial of our own history, pulling down statues of people who did some things that we now look upon as wrong, and they didn't at the time. I mean, the racist people who had absolutely no idea that the Muslims took far more slaves than Christians ever did, and Christians realized it was wrong, and it was Christians who first started stopping the slave trade. And in fact, England had stopped slavery within the borders of England by the 12th century. They don't know any of that stuff. It's just race hustling, basically, without a culture of any significant depth. In the black community had the same sort of social statistics as the white one at the beginning of the 20th century, in terms of marrying and staying married and looking after your children. There was no significant difference. Black society started falling apart somewhere around the 1920s, and no one has explained to me why yet. I hope that someone will. I mean, there's clearly people who are thinking about it deeply and have access to material. I would like to hear what Tom Sowell says about that. Denzel Washington is very, very straightforward. He says what's happened is a failure of fathering. But it started before that, in actual fact. But the Johnson egregious legislation, which would only give a woman a pension money supplement to bring up her children if there was no man living with her. That was an incentive to have a one-parent family. That's crazy, because that's also a recipe for crime. As Denzel Washington puts it, he said, when there's no man in the family, the boy is going to find the man he needs on the street, and we all know what that means. He said it in a sentence perfectly. So what's bothering me is the structure, the moral structure that we're losing. We know that during the lockdown, cheating was rampant, with exams that were done online and honor-coded, so to speak. You weren't testing the child, and depending on how much the family cared about education, you would get more and more cheating. Not setting out to be cheating, but sort of secondary cheating. And parents would look over the shoulder and say, that's not quite right, is it? That's cheating at that level. But of course, your grades determine which school you will go to, but they don't determine your ability. There are consequences. If you improve your child's marks by checking their work before it's taken to the teacher, they will get higher marks than they would have otherwise got. They will get themselves promoted beyond their abilities, and they will have the most neurotic, unsatisfying life you can imagine. You want them to be relatively free as childhood, and you're looking for passions that come along that you can encourage. I don't care what it is, stamp collecting, bird watching, even baseball statistics, something that they work hard at and they're learning in that process. Professorial positions are a good example of where this disaster really shows up big time. I jokingly, and only half jokingly, say you should never apply for a professorial position. You should be asked to apply. If you decide you want to be a professor, you may be lucky and have got it right. But if other people decide you should be a professor, it's because they've seen something that matters. To do the job and have a reasonable life and time with your family and be relaxed, you need to be able to do it like any other job, easily, because it comes naturally to you. You do it the way you're meant to. A decent professor doesn't need notes to teach undergraduates. And the best ones never use them. I was just reading one of the other things in the last week that brings up today's talk, or ramble would be a better term probably. No, was Isaiah Berlin, who published very little. His lectures were packed, and he never had notes. I now have the problem of sorting out whether it was him or Lord Acton, but they both said the same thing in slightly different ways, which is that the real choice that we should be putting before our children is not quite what we think it is. He says, to do the right thing is a form of freedom. Freedom is not the freedom to do what you wish, but the freedom to do what you ought. Now, both Acton and Isaiah Berlin said a version of that, and Kant said something similar. Of course, it goes back to the Old Testament. You could summarize the law. If you keep it, you flourish. If you don't, you don't. And when you don't flourish, crime increases. You lock your doors, you lock yourself in, freedom disappears. They are related to one another. But do we teach that to our children? Could you imagine saying that in a high school class today? I hope hundreds of people write in and say, I still have my children in a class where a teacher says exactly that. And I will feel a lot better then. But I suspect I won't get a vast amount of mail. It would be interesting if this went viral, so to speak, this little bit, and to see worldwide how many people would say, yeah, my kids are being taught that true freedom consists in doing what you ought, not what you want. For most kids, freedom is the freedom not to be interfered with. It's a frightening world. Good place to stop, I think.
Hey, everybody, thanks for watching. If you want to stick around, I left a little bit at the end of this podcast where John and I were just going back and forth about some things. So if you want to listen to that, please do. If not, we will see you guys again next week. Thank you for watching this. If you enjoyed it, please share this with a friend or a colleague. Thank you guys so much.
And of course, what I was going to go to and didn't is Romans 7. The good that I would, I do not. The evil that I would not, that I do. And perhaps next time we'll go there.
Great.
Because a lot of people, because they have this happy faith, like to think that Paul was describing a pre-conversion experience. But you and I know that it's an ongoing post-Christian experience too. We don't start our week intending to even annoy anyone, but we do, and worse. The difference is that we are to consider ourselves dead to sin and alive to righteousness. Consider. You think about it, and slowly it happens.
Okay.
In what we're trying to do, I think, is in Tom Holland's comment when he wrote a history of Islam and discovered that he'd become a Christian. Because Paul and Jesus had put time bombs under Western culture. And the ripples of those explosions are still being felt to this day. There's a lovely clip which you could probably find. It's in Tom Holland and Tom Wright being interviewed on a British website. Unbelievable, I think, is the website.
Mm-hmm.
And Tom Wright, who's an incredibly erudite theologian, is listening to Tom Holland describing this event, and Tom is nodding, especially when he says, Paul and Jesus put a bomb under Western culture.
Yeah.
And it's a proper understanding of human nature, of course, amongst many other things. They put a series of bombs under us. So, let's hope the good Lord sees reason to use what we're doing. But if he doesn't, that's all right too. We accept that he has mercy on whom he will have mercy, as Augustine reminds us. But I think parents could do a lot more than they're doing, don't you?
Trying to figure that out. Yes. It's hard to know where to go.
Well,
or
you've got to have
just
serious stuff
ill-equipped.
to read. I mean, I trust you've read the Narnia stories to all your children.
My wife did, yes.
Your wife did it. You
Yeah.
should do it.
Okay.
It's good to read them as teenagers as well. They're very good to read if you go on a canoeing trip or something like that, where you can't go somewhere where there's nothing to be gotten on a phone. And the best things to read, the Narnia stories came up, and Shakespeare plays. My kids loved going on a canoe trip, and they'd each get a copy of a Shakespeare play, and they'd read it aloud around the fire.
You have any Shakespeare play recommendations? I don't think I've ever read one.
Well, start by watching with your children Much Ado About Nothing on the box. Kenneth Branagh's film. It's got the Kenneth Branagh one is the one you want. Branagh. It's absolutely brilliant. And I realized I had been wrong in thinking that Shakespeare had to wait, because my grandchildren who grew up in Malawi with no screens for a long while. And so they watched a lot of videos. And one of the videos that got to them was that Kenneth Branagh, Much Ado About Nothing. And then one summer, they were visiting us here. We have Shakespeare on the St. Lawrence mini festival, where some professional actors come in and do a Shakespeare play in an outdoor auditorium area on the river. And this particular year, it was Much Ado About Nothing. Within minutes, the actors knew that these three kids knew every word of this play. They knew every joke before it came up. So, in effect, they started playing to my grandkids. And that literally, they know that play inside out, because they heard it at the right time, in the right way. So they don't have any hang-ups about Shakespeare. They know it's worth the effort. But Much Ado About Nothing just carries you along with the whole story. And, of course, there's always things about vengeance. Is it proper? Is it right? Is it wrong? Love, it's there too. It's amusing. It's brilliant, as all Shakespeare's plays are. Just get it and find a time when you can show it to children, then tell me how they respond. And your wife too. She'll love it.
Yeah, I'll do that.
She read any Shakespeare either?
Oh, I'm sure she has. She's way more well-read than I am.
Yeah. Well, yeah. When they're bored and they can't find anything to do, then you can say, well, let's spend just 20 minutes, and then if you like it, we'll do the whole thing. We'll keep going. But they'll be sucked in the first 20 minutes. Because it's superb cinema that is made.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
Good.
All right.
Okay,
Thank you, John.
have a good week.
See you next week. Bye.